Nagumo was aware of the return of Chikuma's No. 1 scout plane as a result of weather conditions, but he had no way of knowing that the other two aircraft were not doing their jobs. All he knew for certain was that he had heard no tidings at all from his disengaged flank. So far as he and his staff were aware, everything was going pretty much according to plan. Within an hour, though, he would be disabused of that notion in the most inconvenient way imaginable. At precisely 0700, Akagi finally received word from Tomonaga regarding the outcome of the morning's strike when another decoded transmission was brought up to the bridge. The strike leader's message was blunt enough. There is need for a second attack wave. Around the bridge, mental shoulder-shrugging was the order of the day, no big surprise there. 70-odd bombers had indeed been insufficient to put Midway out of business, just as many of the staff had foreseen. Now the question was what to do about it. The manner with which Tomonaga transmitted his message, which was clearly noted by the American Signals Intelligence Unit on Hawaii, also supports the picture of a force that knew all along that it would have to strike Midway again this day. Tomonaga's message a single code group repeated 3 times. Kawa 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 0400 was strongly reminiscent of the famous Tora 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 signal used at Pearl Harbor, and is indicative of a pre-arranged message format. No matter what Yamamoto's instructions had been regarding only needing to hit Midway once, it seems clear that Nagumo's staff had arranged prior to Tomonaga's departure that the strike leader should have this certain code group in his back pocket if need be. Having sortied a day late, with less time to reduce the island before the landings, it is little wonder that Kid Butai had anticipated hitting the place more than once this day, and had planned accordingly. While Nagumo pondered Tomonaga's signal, Akagi prepared to reinforce the combat air patrol still further. As soon as Tanaka's previous threesome of Zeros had been brought on board and stowed down the forward elevator, the same elevator began bringing up more fighters. The next group of 5 aircraft to go up would include 3 from the 6th Kokutai, under the command of Lieutenant Kaneko Tadashi. Kaneko, a fine pilot, who would go on to make ace, was just itching to get into action. Commander Masuda, Akagi's Hikocho, had seen no reason not to use the cargo aircraft in this fashion. Spotting began a little before 0700. Soryu was spotting 3 fighters of her own. Both ships sent their Zeros up at 0710, just as the first real American attack developed. Japanese lookouts on Akagi spotted enemy planes coming in low at 0710. Captain Aoki turned the flagship to head into them. Probably none of the men on the bridge recognized these particular aircraft. They were, in fact, 6 of the Americans' new TBF Avenger torpedo planes and 4 twin-engined B-26 Maurauder medium bombers. Neither had earned much of a reputation in the Pacific War thus far. In fact, this was the first combat mission ever for an Avenger. Both types were big and robust, and the B-26 was blazing fast as well. The 2 American formations were coming in on the bows of the lead carriers. As far as the Japanese could tell, they were attempting a version of an anvil attack, except that instead of targeting a single ship on either bow, which might have produced results, they unwittingly chose to divide their attentions between the 2 division flagships Akagi and Hiryu. This was hardly surprising, given that one flight was manned by US Army aviators, the other by Navy flyers, neither of whom had had any opportunity to coordinate their attacks with their opposite numbers. Their near-simultaneous arrival at their objective was wholly unintentional. Akagi had several KP fighters up, including a Shutai led by W.O. Ono Zenji, a second under Lieutenant Ibusuke Masanobu, and now Lieutenant Kaneko's still-launching formation. Kaneko headed straight toward the B-26s along with the rest of the flagship's complement. At the same time, Hiryu's fighters also swung into action. She had 7 in the air, including a Shutai apiece under PO-1C Hino Masato and WO Kodama Yoshimi. The 7th plane was that of PO-2C Sakai Ichiro, the final plane from Hiryu's first cap watch that had gone up at 0430. His flight mates Lieutenant Mori and wingman PO-2C Yamamoto Toru had already landed at 0700, but Sakai had not yet made it down and apparently decided to peel out of his landing approach to join in the fray. Soryu's and Kaga's fighters also contributed, although it is likely that they played more of a role in the latter stages of the action. Kaga's first cap watch of 2 planes under the very senior P-01C Yamamoto Akira, and her second watch of 5 planes under ENS. Yamaguchi Hiroyuki both made their presence known. Soryu, likewise, sent at least 2 Shutai in to the attack, including P-01C Harada Kaname's trio and the newly launched Lati Fujita Iyozo and his 2 wingmen. Thus, Kid Butai dispatched a total of over 30 fighters to destroy the 10 American warplanes of this first raid. The American aviators quickly discovered that Japanese carrier fighter pilots were every bit as good as their reputations made them out to be. Kid Butai's fighters set upon the interlopers like wolves. For their part, though, the Japanese found the B-26s speedy and difficult to bring down. Not only that, but the sleek American bombers had decent defensive armament as well. Akagi's P-03C Hanyu Toichiro discovered this fact to his cost, killed by a Marauder's fire during the engagement. The Avengers, too, exacted a price, splashing the late-landing Sakai within sight of his ship. Yet the Zeros methodically slashed at the bombers with well-timed runs, culling them out of their groups and bringing them down. They hurled at least one of the Marauders flaming into the sea, probably at the hands of the skilled Lieutenant Kaneko. To the north, Lieutenant Fujita's flyers began scoring heavily on the Avengers. The Americans could do little but grimly hang on, boring in low and fast. The Avengers were savaged, all but one of them eventually being destroyed. The few American aircraft that managed to remain aloft were in tough shape as well, all of them holed dozens or even hundreds of times. Yet despite the prodigious punishment they meted out, the cap couldn't bring all of the attackers down before they reached their drop points. On board Hiryu, Second Lieutenant Nagayasu Yasukuni, commander of her starboard 5-inch guns, gave the order to commence firing. Hiryu cranked up to flank speed, 34 knots, and turned hard to port to unmask her starboard batteries. Across the way, Akagi was doing the same, and Tone, Chikuma, and Nagara were all blazing away as well. Finally, under heavy attack, several of the planes launched their torpedoes. To the cool eyes on board the carriers, it was clear that the Americans weren't very good at this sort of thing. They had dropped their fish much too far away. Yet drop them they did, and their targets had no choice but to react. Nagara had been targeted by an Avenger pilot who had dumped his torpedo at whatever ship was closest, thinking his badly shot-up plane was about to go in the drink. Hiryu simply ran away from the pair that had been launched against her. Meanwhile, Captain Aoki first threw his big ship into a looping port turn to avoid the torpedoes being aimed at Hiryu by the Avengers, then executed a neat 180 back to starboard to avoid the fish dropped by the surviving B-26. In the process, Akagi received a strafing from one of the Marauders as it roared overhead after its attack. The flagship's No. 2 machine gun mount suffered some minor damage, and 2 men were killed. The American aircraft were suddenly gone, except for one. This particular B-26, having been hit by Akagi's automatic weapons, made no effort to pull out of its run. Instead, he bored in directly at Akagi's bridge, where Nagumo and his staff stared wide-eyed back at their assailant. The plane was either unnavigable, or the American pilot, knowing his life was forfeit in any case, had decided to sell himself dearly. The bridge watch were stunned. Americans weren't supposed to show this sort of bravery. Then reflexes took over, and the men ducked as the American plane barreled in. There was no chance of it missing now. But instead of an explosion, the green bomber somehow flashed past the top of the island and cartwheeled into the sea. Nagumo and his staff let out a collective shout of relief. How it had missed, no one knew, but that had been too close by half. If Tomonaga's message 15 minutes earlier hadn't already decided matters for Nagumo, the determined self-sacrifice of this particular Marauder may well have done so. Having just evaded torpedoes, been strafed, and then nearly been turned into a bomber hood ornament, Nagumo's blood was up. Enough was enough. It was clear that Midway was still full of fight, and until the island was neutralized, it would be a threat. The Americans had not been terribly skilled, but everyone on the bridge had just witnessed firsthand how important luck was in combat. Had the American plane been 10 feet lower, Akagi's island would have been given a daisy cutter, and the staff of 1st Air Fleet would have all been killed outright. It was time to put the American base out of business. However, attacking Midway in an effective manner meant disobeying direct orders from Yamamoto that the striking force keep its reserve aircraft armed for anti-ship operations. Nagumo has been endlessly pilloried for deciding to violate this order. Yet very few people have reflected on the practical implications of not doing so, or on whether Yamamoto's order was sound in the first place. Had Nagumo rigidly adhered to his superior's wishes, what were his realistic options for beating down the island's defences? Was he simply to let Tomonaga's men go back out later in the day to finish the job? Nagumo, after all, had absolutely no detailed information regarding the state of the island after Tomonaga's attack. All he knew was that his flight leader had thought a second strike necessary. Relying on only half of his force to single-handedly bring about Midway's destruction, even over the course of multiple attacks, really didn't make much sense. Tomonaga's air group was bound to take losses in the process, and as it did so, it would become weaker even if the enemy was correspondingly weakened as well. Yet Yamamoto's orders presumably would have kept Agusa and the rest of the A-team sunning themselves on the flight decks, while Tomonaga and his men beat themselves bloody. The whole idea was simply asinine. Genda certainly agreed with this assessment, remarking after the war that Yamamoto's instructions were inflexible. He added that if the order had been adhered to, one half of the attack force would be kept idle unless a suitable enemy target was located. A decision should have been made depending upon the circumstances. Kusaka, too, felt that it was intolerable for the commander at the front to keep his half-strength in readiness indefinitely only for an enemy force which might not be in the area after all. Both men were absolutely correct in their judgment. The job of Admiral Nagumo and his staff was to craft timely, appropriate responses to the conditions then pertaining. Regarding Midway, one approach that strongly recommended itself at this juncture was reducing Kid Butai's own casualties by bringing overwhelming power to bear on the enemy, an approach to warfare that has been highly regarded since mankind first started sharpening sticks. If no American warships were nearby, it clearly made sense for Nagumo too. Attack Midway with as large a follow-up strike as possible in order to force the, presumably, depleted enemy into an even more unfavourable attritional spiral. There was another practical reason for violating the order, that of time. Regardless of what condition Tomonaga's group came home in, it would be a matter of several hours before they could be turned around for another attack. Planes had to be refueled and rearmed, damaged aircraft patched up, and the pilots debriefed and fed. Replacement aviators would need to be slotted in for the crewmen who had been wounded. A new mission plan would have to be created, the pilots briefed, and then the attack force armed, fueled, spotted, and launched. This probably could not have happened before the early afternoon. Giving the enemy more time to lick his own wounds and recover made no sense whatsoever. It was far better to hit the Americans again as quickly as possible, preferably while their aircraft were on the ground and being refueled. Here, in the cold light of combat on the morning of 4th of June, Yamamoto's earlier order was revealed for what it was, twaddle. Concocted in the unreal atmosphere of May's war games, his instructions contained no operational parameters and no indications as to when Agusa's force could be considered available for land attack operations. Was Nagumo to reserve these aircraft until the outward-bound legs of the recon flights were completed, or until the scouts returned to Kid Butai, or simply forever? Apparently no one knew. Yamamoto's order, if literally interpreted, essentially condemned Nagumo to fight with one hand tied behind his back, pitting Tomonaga's strike group against Midway in a pathetic race to see who limped to impotence first. Had Yamamoto truly been concerned about the US Navy making its presence felt in the initial phase of operations, he should have backed up his reserve strike concept with requirements for a realistic scouting scheme and other contingency plans, so as to guarantee Nagumo's ability to deal with one opponent at a time. Instead, he had delivered a single flippant order verbally, almost casually, and without any set of guiding particulars or modifying conditions. When viewed in this light, it is almost impossible to anticipate Nagumo not making the decision to hit the island again with his reserve force at some point during the morning. Nagumo has also been castigated for not waiting to rearm his reserve aircraft until the morning's reconnaissance searches were completed. This criticism hits nearer the mark, in that, as will be seen, his relatively speedy decision to commence rearming deprived the force of vital time when a valid scouting report actually arrived. However, it should be remembered that by 07:15, the meaningful portions of the morning's searches were completed for all intents and purposes. The scout aircraft had now been aloft for nearly 3 hours. They had already run their outbound routes and were currently halfway through their left-hand doglegs as well. Within 15 minutes, all of them would be turning for home. As soon as that occurred, the symmetry of the search pattern would break down as the search planes began individually converging on Kid Butai. It was probably never expected that anyone would find anything on the inbound leg in any case. In the midst of these goings-on, Nagumo had been handed a message that had just been forwarded from Kaga. Kaga's Hikocho, see Dr. Amagai Takahisa, had apparently received a message regarding the effects of the Midway attack from Kaga's dive bomber leader, Lieutenant Ogawa Shoichi, at 0640. Ogawa reported that Sand Island had been bombed and great results obtained. Nagumo had only to recall the American Marauders boring in a few minutes previously to put Ogawa's optimistic assessment into proper perspective. Accordingly, at 0715, Nagumo sent the following message to the fleet. Planes in second attack wave stand by to carry out attack today. Re-equip yourselves with bombs. At Eros 720, Akagi took on board a single Zero. This plane, piloted by PO-1C Iwashiro Yoshio, had been airborne a grand total of 25 minutes. His shot-eye leader, later Ibusuke Masanobu, was still aloft with the cap. His wingman, Hanyu, was already dead. Iwashiro was likely out of cannon ammunition, having just experienced firsthand the amount of punishment American bombers could take and dish out before folding. This would become a common occurrence during the morning, with several Japanese fighters going up and coming right back down again after an attack. With 60 rounds of cannon ammunition for each of the Zero's 2 cannons, they weren't good for more than a few firing runs. Iwashiro's plane was quickly struck below. Down below, the hangar crews were beginning to carry out the rearming order issued 5 minutes previously. As will be recalled, the reserve strike aircraft had not been on the flight decks yet this morning. Consequently, there had been no need to send these aircraft back below to be worked on. Within the hangars, the 43 carrier attack planes on board Cardiff-1 were currently armed with torpedoes. These would need to be changed to Type 80 land bombs for the attack against the atoll. However, on board Cardiff-2, the 34 Kanbaku were still unarmed at this point because that normally occurred on the flight deck during spotting. Thus, none of them needed to be rearmed either. Nagumo's orders really only pertained in an immediate sense to the Type 97 aircraft on board Akagi and Kaga. Until Cardiff-1 had completed rearming, Cardiff-2 would wait to begin its spot. This represents a rather different vision of the rearming situation than has been portrayed in most texts on the battle, which have all 4 carriers engaged in frantic rearming activities at this time. On board Cardiff-1, though, the activity was real enough. Changing from torpedoes to bombs was no simple matter. Not only did it require removing the torpedo from the aircraft, it also entailed changing the mounting hardware, tokaki, on the belly of the aircraft. Unlike the dive bombers, whose main payloads were roughly the same size and shape whether they were high explosive or semi-armor piercing, the Type 97 aircraft carried ordnance that differed wildly in shape, requiring differently shaped mounting brackets as well. Thus, rearming with new ordnance was a complex multi-step operation. In Akagi, armourers pushed their 6 heavy carts out to the waiting kank and began the process of detaching the torpedo-carrying harness. They then lowered the torpedo onto the cart via the plane's winch. Once it was down, a team of handlers began pushing it gingerly through the crowded hangar and back to the ordnance elevator to take it back below. However, once the men arrived, they found the elevator already in use, hauling Type 80 bombs up to the hangar deck. Indeed, the bomb handlers in the magazines quickly let it be known that they had their hands full just getting the bombs out of storage and not to send anything down to them yet. The armourers on the hangar deck had little choice in the matter except to deposit their loads in the holding racks next to the ordnance elevator. Each carrier had sets of curving brackets attached to the hangar bulkheads near the bomb lift for temporary storage of ordnance in just such situations. One by one, the torpedoes were secured to the racks using block and tackle, and then the men moved the cart back to the elevator to receive the bomb. As always, the bombs came up in pieces. They would need to be assembled before they were attached to their planes. Meanwhile, back at the aircraft, another group of men was sweating to remove the old tokaki and get the new hardware screwed into the plane. This operation took some 20 minutes to perform amid the clatter of wrenches and the grunts of the armourers. Kaga was going through the same motions. She had a larger kank squadron, but she also had 9 ordnance carts, as opposed to Akagi's 6. The net result was that the time needed to change Kaga's squadron over was identical. The limiting factor in the operation was not the number of aircraft, but rather the 1.3 ratio of carts to planes. All in all, it took around half an hour to rearm a kanko, the bulk of the time being spent in changing the mounting hardware and assembling the bomb. Despite the portrayals of the entire hangar buzzing with activity, in truth, the action was rather localized. While the first chutai was attended to, the maintenance crews for the other 12 kanko of Akagi's group simply idled. Their mounting hardware couldn't be switched until the torpedoes were off, which in turn required a cart. With only 6 carts to go around, it was a long process, one marked by tedium for the crews waiting to get one, followed by frantic labour as they tried to replace the tokaki as quickly as possible. Armed with this information, we can make some fairly accurate estimates concerning what Nagumo's options were at any given time during the morning. The math is reasonably straightforward: half an hour to rearm a single chutai, 3 chutai per carrier, and only 1 chutai can be rearmed at a time, hence an hour and a half to rearm the lot. Once complete, about 45 minutes were then required to lift, spot, warm up, and launch the attack group. For dive bombers, a few minutes longer would probably be added on the flight deck for arming. All in all, it would not be unreasonable to assume that 2.5 hours would be required before the force could be completely rearmed, spotted, and warmed up for launch. This meant that at a bare minimum, with no interruptions, the reserve strike force would not be ready much before 09:30. This time estimate stands in contrast to estimates put forth in earlier Western tracts that suggest that an hour and a half might have been sufficient for sending off the second strike. Furthermore, it is clear from the foregoing that attacking Midway 2.5 hours from when the order was given with full deckload strikes from all 4 carriers was only achievable if everything went smoothly, above decks and below. This projected launch time obviously depended heavily on the speediness of the forthcoming recovery operations. Tomonaga's planes would begin orbiting the carriers at around 08:15, while rearming was still going on in the hangars of Cardiff 1. If the reserve strike was to be spotted starting at 08:45, i.e., an hour and a half from the time the rearming order was given, all of Tomonaga's strike aircraft would need to be recovered and stowed below to clear the flight deck for spotting. In the days before modern angled flight decks and deck-edge elevators, carriers could do only one thing at a time on their flight deck spot aircraft, launch aircraft, or recover aircraft. For all practical purposes, one operation could not be started until the other was complete. It is true, of course, that if Nagumo had given the word to attack promptly at 7:15, he could probably have struck Midway with just the dive bombers from Cardiff II. These aircraft were as yet unarmed. They could have been spotted, armed, and launched by about 0800. However, this would have meant scrapping the idea of a coordinated strike with the 1st Carrier Division's Kanko, which were to operate in a level bombing role. Japanese doctrine, as we have seen, vastly preferred the idea of launching balanced deckload strikes, thereby gaining the benefits of combined arms. Consequently, a partial strike would probably not have been considered as an option at 0715. This made perfectly good sense. Midway wasn't going anywhere, and there were no indications as yet that there would be any difficulty in sending off a second strike after Tomonaga landed. Apparently, in anticipation of needing the decks cleared for Tomonaga's return, several of the carriers began cycling their cap fighters. Kaga recovered 3 planes from her second watch at 0730, while across the way Soryu simultaneously brought down all 6 aircraft from her first 2 cap watches. At 0736, Akagi landed another lone 0, while Hiryu brought on board 2 fighters at 0740. At the end of these operations, Kido Butai had only 14 fighters aloft, down from the 31 it had up between 0710 and 0725. Akagi landed an additional plane at 0740, but it wasn't a fighter, but rather W.O. Suzuki Shigeru's Type 97 reconnaissance aircraft that had been launched with the morning strike. This aircraft had patrolled the number 1 search line, flying almost due south. It had detected nothing. By about 0740, the rearming operations had been underway for about half an hour. Kaga and Akagi's first Chutai of Type 97s, 9 and 6 planes respectively, were both nearing the end of the rearming process, leaving 2 more Chutai to go on each ship. Both ships of Cardiff I were also currently holding a course into the wind in order to bring on board additional fighters. Suddenly, in the midst of these proceedings, came a bolt from the blue. Tone's No. 4 scout plane sent the following report. Sight what appears to be 10 enemy surface units, in position bearing 10 degrees distance 240 miles from Midway. Course 150 degrees, speed over 20 knots. This was a stunning development because it stood every assumption of Yamamoto's plan on its head. Nagumo and his staff quickly huddled to discuss the implications. It is important to clarify the exact delivery time of Tone No. 4's message to the bridge of Akagi, because this matter has been subjected to great scrutiny. Nagumo's composite log indicates that the original signal was transmitted to Tone at 0728. It may well be that Amari had spotted the Americans sometime before this. It was the practice of Japanese search aircraft to work their way around the perimeter of an enemy formation before transmitting. Doing so would hopefully confuse the enemy as to the actual bearing back to the carrier force once the scout breached radio silence. As a result, we cannot know the exact time that Amari actually sighted the American force, only when he transmitted. It has generally been supposed that Amari's transmission made it up to Akagi's bridge sometime before 0745, because Nagumo's battle report logs an order at that time to reverse the earlier rearming order and to leave torpedoes on those attack planes which have not as yet been changed to bombs. However, at least one contemporary historian, Dallas Isom, has asserted that Nagumo actually did not receive Amari's transmission until 0800 or later. As part of this theory, it has been proposed that Nagumo's orders to reverse arming may have been misrecorded in the composite log that forms the basis of the Nagumo report. This notion is vaguely supported by Nagumo's own statement in the summary section of his report that Tone No. 4's message was not received until about 0800, and is repeated in other Japanese materials as well. However, in this particular case, it is clear that Nagumo did receive Amari's transmission about the same time it was logged in the Nagumo report. Furthermore, Nagumo thereupon acted on this information with great alacrity. This is confirmed not by Japanese sources, but by those of the enemy. At 0740, American radio intelligence logged Amari's third message of his flight thus far, reporting the initial sighting of the Americans. More important, American signals intelligence on Hawaii also noted a return transmission from Akagi at 0747, requesting that tone number 4 retain contact. Surprisingly, this signal was sent in the clear without being encoded. The impression one gets is that Nagumo was quite concerned at Amari's sighting report, enough so that the need for a speedy response to his scout apparently outweighed any need for signal security. Thus, the theory that Nagumo experienced a delay in receiving tone number 4's message cannot be supported. Likewise, it is clear that Nagumo did not dawdle in his deliberations. Upon receiving Amari's message, he immediately reversed his arming orders and then promptly asked for clarification from his scout regarding what had been seen. However, Isom is quite correct in noting that tone number 4's detection of TF-16 at 0728 was actually one of the few pieces of good luck that Nagumo was to receive this day. On the face of it, this seems an incredible statement. After all, tone number 4's tardiness in taking off has commonly been held up as one of the crucial Japanese failures during the battle. Yet, a careful examination of the American course tracks overlaid by the original Japanese search pattern provides an important revelation. Had Amari been launched promptly at 0430 and actually flown his route as prescribed in the original search plan, he would have flown well south of both American formations on his outbound route and would not have detected them until the inbound leg. This would have delayed his likely detection time until at least 800, meaning that Nagumo, in turn, would probably not have had an initial report in hand until closer to 0815 or later. Not only that, but had Amari actually flown his prescribed route after his delayed launch, the situation would have been made worse still. It was only Amari's unauthorized truncation of his search pattern, or perhaps muddled navigation, coupled with his apparent decision to dogleg north at around 6:45, that put him in a position to make his initial sighting report, badly flawed though it was. The question then remains, what should Nagumo have done at this time? Finding the right answer to Nagumo's conundrum, if such even exists, has consumed endless gallons of ink over the years. Much of it, regrettably, has been spilled to little purpose. For without having a clear grasp of what the actual state of the Japanese force was, and what was and was not possible for their carriers in the way of operations, a meaningful analysis of Nagumo's options cannot be constructed. Since this was perhaps the critical point in the battle for Nagumo, it's worth spending the time to lay these issues out in detail. Nagumo's command decisions were governed by three primary constraints. The first was time. It's worth remembering at this juncture, reading at our leisure decades later in the quiet of a library or our own home, that Nagumo had approximately 15 minutes to find the correct solution to a set of operational problems whose outlines, because of the spotty intelligence endemic to this morning's actions, he only partially grasped. The second constraint was the physical arrangement of Akagi's bridge. Unlike us, Nagumo wasn't parked in an easy chair. Indeed, a factor that has been entirely overlooked until now is the nature of Akagi's command facilities and the effect these likely had on the Admiral's ability to reason clearly. Akagi's bridge was a tiny trapezoid, some 15 feet wide and 12 feet long. Containing little more than a small map table, a chart locker, and several sets of pedestal-mounted spotting binoculars, it was extraordinarily cramped. In this tiny space stood at least 5 officers, Nagumo, Kusaka, Genda, Captain Aoki, and Akagi's navigator, Commander Miura. In addition, if Fuchida's account is to be believed, several other individuals were present at least some of the time as well. Captain Oishi, Kusaka's senior staff member, Lieutenant C. Dr. Ono, Staff Intelligence Officer, Lieutenant C. Dr. Nishibayashi, Staff Flag Secretary, Commander Masuda, Akagi's Achik, and Fuchida himself. Of these, Oishi and Ono appear to have been present at all times. Fuchida apparently came and went at various points during the morning, and Nishibayashi was likely doing the same. Commander Masuda would perforce have been spending much of his time on the air control platform on the aft end of the island, one level lower, but would have been coming up to the bridge periodically to report to Captain Aoki on the state of air operations. In addition, a minimum of several enlisted personnel were required on the bridge for lookout duty and running messages. Taken together, it's difficult to imagine that there were fewer than a dozen individuals in the command spaces almost constantly. The men had to have been standing practically shoulder to shoulder, with Nagumo and his staff crammed into the starboard half of the bridge. Nagumo was unlikely to be able to give or receive candid opinions from his staff in such a setting. The Japanese, as a rule, do not like interpersonal confrontations and tend to shun uncomfortable social situations. Kusaka and Genda were undoubtedly sensitive to the fact that Nagumo was not as well versed in naval aviation matters as he needed to be. Yet, in such a setting, they probably would have been unwilling to make the full extent of their own knowledge known, because that would risk embarrassing their commander in front of Captain Aoki and the ship's crew. Nagumo, for his part, would certainly not have wanted to reveal his own shortcomings in these matters. In such a setting, it's difficult to construct a scenario wherein a truly fluid exchange of information was possible. Worse yet, there was no place Nagumo and his staff could retreat for some temporary privacy and still be in proximity to Akagi's command and communications equipment. Akagi's island was simply too small. These miserable arrangements stand in stark contrast to the facilities on board Iwu-2 American carriers, which were made possible by the American vessels having much larger islands. On each of the Yorktown-class ships there was a separate bridge for both the captain and the admiral. The ship's captain was not even allowed inside the admiral's bridge without an invitation from the flag. As such, an American admiral was free to discuss, debate, or flat-out argue with his staff members behind closed doors. They were shielded from the distracting hubbub of the ship's helm and watchman, allowing them to focus strictly on the management of the battle. The admiral had a sea cabin located in the island, allowing him to take naps if needed in order to maintain his alertness. In addition, American admirals often had their own separate radio facilities located nearby in the island as well. All of these were luxuries Nagumo could only have dreamed of in the Spartan and completely public setting of Akagi. It should be noted, too, that during much of the morning, Akagi was either being directly attacked or was under threat of same. During these periods, the ship was frequently maneuvering at high speeds. Nagumo had nearly been killed by a B-26 40 minutes earlier and would shortly witness several new attacks requiring additional defensive gyrations from his flagship, accompanied by cap actions and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Akagi was also conducting flight operations with some frequency. Stuck as he was in a cramped fishbowl, it's likely Nagumo spent a fair amount of his time looking out the window at these various happenings and trying to gauge their importance. In other words, the situation on the bridge was uncomfortable, noisy, and distracting in the extreme. Kusaka noted that even the ship's public address system was barely audible above the din. It's hardly surprising that in such a setting, Nagumo found it difficult to reason either quickly or clearly. Nagumo's third major constraint revolved around his deck operations. A solution for Nagumo had to proceed on the basis of what was actually possible on the flight decks. Down through the years, numerous commentators on the battle have offered facile solutions for Nagumo's conundrum that have ignored these very real limitations. For instance, why could not the Japanese have moved their strike force to the flight decks and then rolled the strike aircraft forward of the crash barriers to warm up while the morning strike was recovered? Then, after recovering Tomonaga's aircraft and striking them below, why couldn't the strike aircraft, now presumably warmed up and ready for launch, be rolled back to the rear of the flight deck for spotting? The answer to questions like these is that some of these operations might have been technically possible, but the Imperial Navy had never tried doing any of them before. 0800 on 4th June was a lousy time to try to figure out how. Militaries fight as they train. They absolutely have to, or they would descend into utter chaos when confronted by the enormous pressures of battle. Any attempt to monkey with fundamental activities as complex as deck operations was guaranteed to lead to confusion, wasted time, and a degraded operational tempo. This was precisely what the Japanese did not need at this time. Consequently, whatever Nagumo decided to do needed to be crafted from operational building blocks that were known commodities to the ship's crews. Finally, it must be recognized that even if there was a right solution for the situation Nagumo found himself in, odds were that it would not be easy to implement, risk-free, or even likely to forestall all of the horror and misery destined to descend on the Japanese this day. At this point in the battle, with the basic logic of the operational plan revealed as nonsense, the scouting plan in a shambles, and an unforeseen enemy suddenly on their flank, there was no magic solution that was going to transform the battle's outcome. Errors in strategy as grievous as the Japanese had inflicted on themselves are rarely reversible. Instead, the best that could really be hoped for was finding an approach whereby Kid Butai had a reasonable chance of coming away with some of its carriers intact, or at least having extracted a heavy toll from the Americans. What then did Nagumo have to work with in the way of actionable information? The answer is not much. In fact, there were three worrisome aspects to Tone No. 4's sighting report. First, the enemy's position as given by Amari just didn't make any sense at all. If Tone No. 4 had indeed sighted American surface ships where he said he did, then he had encountered them well to the north of his appointed outbound search route. Indeed, the Americans appeared to be in the search sector of Chikuma's No. 5 search line, so why hadn't that plane spotted the Americans first? Either Amari was out of place, or the enemy force wasn't where he had reported it to be. In fact, Amari's initial report placed the Americans some 60 miles north-northeast of their actual location. Indications are that Nagumo knew that scout aircraft sometimes took great liberties when working a contact and therefore doubted some aspects of Amari's report. Yet he had little choice but to take it at face value in terms of the reported location of the Americans. Second, Tone No. 4's report was miserably bereft of any indication as to what sort of American warships were out there. 10 enemy surface units. Just what did that mean? Within minutes of the message's receipt, Nagumo sent a signal back to Tone No. 4 to ascertain the American ship types. Yet despite the absence of positive confirmation that a carrier was with the enemy force, the presence of 10 warships of any kind should have been highly suspicious. The American task force, if it could attack with aircraft, was ideally located to ambush Nagumo's carriers. Indeed, as one historian of the battle has noted, there was no point in any enemy task force being where Amari said it was, unless it could attack with aircraft. Third, upon closer examination, the fact that the enemy was steering a course of 150 degrees was ominous in itself. The prevailing winds of the morning had been from out of the southeast, although they were presently shifting around to the northeast in the area near Kid Butai. Such a course track could well be indicative of an enemy task force launching aircraft. It would seem that the significance of some or all of these clues was not lost on Nagumo and his staff. Kusaka was apparently of the opinion that there couldn't be an enemy force without carriers in the area reported. If Senshi S. Sho is any indication, this appears to have been Nagumo's belief as well. However, and this is a critical point, both the Admiral and his staff came to the conclusion that whatever enemy force was out there was most probably a surface force. The Americans may have had at least one carrier in attendance with that force, but it was not viewed as a carrier force per se. Despite these ambiguities, there were several pieces of information that could be used to craft an operational plan. First, it was now clear that the Americans had a naval force in the area, and prudence would dictate that it be treated as if it contained a carrier until proven otherwise. Second, given that Nagumo's approximate location had been known to the enemy for almost 2 hours, he had to assume that any enemy carrier in the neighborhood would be in receipt of sighting reports. That meant that they could have launched against him by now. Consequently, Nagumo had every reason to expect further attacks, this time by carrier aircraft, which could arrive at any time. Third, Kid Butai's own geographic position was far from optimal. It was essentially located on the horns of a dilemma. There was no question that the horn to the northeast, the enemy naval force, was potentially the more dangerous of the two, and would have to be attacked as soon as was practical. However, as part of his reaction to this new problem, Nagumo needed to consider maneuvering his force in such a fashion as to minimize the impact of potentially being caught between two enemies. Nagumo basically had two options: to try and mount an immediate attack against the newly detected American force before Tomonaga returned, or to stand pat and attack after Tomonaga had been recovered. Obviously, all things being equal, attacking sooner rather than later would generally have been preferred. However, there were numerous problems with such a course of action. First of all, Nagumo was rightly cautious about launching a strike against the enemy force before conclusive ship identifications had been provided to him. He knew, and everyone on Akagi's bridge knew, what had happened to Rear Admiral Takagi when he had been placed in a similar situation just a month earlier. During the preliminaries at Coral Sea, the commander of Cardiff 5 had launched a powerful group of his aircraft against an American naval target based on what had turned out to be faulty spotting information. As a result, instead of attacking a carrier, the Japanese had wasted their strength sinking an American oiler and destroyer. The second obstacle, of course, was that Nagumo had nothing in the way of strike aircraft ready to go at 0745. No aircraft were currently spotted on his flight decks. The spate of cap fighter landings on all four carriers from ZO-730 to ZO-740 is proof positive of that. For fighters to have landed at that time, the decks absolutely had to be clear astern. Thus, striking immediately could not happen in less than the time it actually took to spot, warm up, and launch a strike. This meant a minimum of 45 minutes from now, that is, at about 8:30 at the earliest. However, Tomonaga's returning force was expected to begin orbiting Nagumo's carriers around 0815, meaning that an immediate strike would need to be launched in time for the morning strike force to land. Tomonaga's group undoubtedly contained damaged aircraft and wounded airmen. They would have been airborne for almost 4 hours by that time, and would soon be running low on fuel, particularly on those aircraft that had suffered battle damage to their wings. It would be imperative to get them down as quickly as possible, and the carrier High-K-Ch would have been keenly aware of this need. As we will shortly see, landing the Midway force, including not only the time to recover aircraft, but also the time needed afterward to clear them off of the flight deck and stow them below, was a process that could not help but take about 20 minutes per carrier. In the event, it was actually to take from around 8:37 to 9:12 to completely land Tomonaga and his men on all four carriers. The clever reader will immediately have noticed that since Tomonaga's force was not to be recovered until 0912 in any case, could not Nagumo have anticipated this and intentionally kept Tomonaga orbiting long enough to launch a full-blown strike with all his aircraft? Working backward from a hypothetical final recovery time for Tomonaga of around 0915 proves an illuminating exercise. If all of Tomonaga's aircraft were to be recovered by then they would need to start recovering by about 0845, or perhaps a bit later. This meant, in turn, that the reserve strike force would have to be launched, and the decks clear, by this time. Again, working backward, that implies an initial spotting time of about 0800 at the latest for the reserve strike force, meaning that rearming would need to be complete by then as well. In other words, if Nagumo was to launch anything before Tomonaga had to come down, he had to begin his spotting almost immediately. Time was, indeed, a very precious commodity. By 0745, one CH tie of Type 97s on Kaga and Akagi had already been rearmed with 800 Kigel bombs. Had Nagumo immediately given the order to stop rearming with bombs at 0745, as it appears he did, he might possibly have caught the armourers in time to prevent them from beginning the switch out of the second Tie's torpedoes. This would have allowed Cardiff 1 to each begin spotting 2 of their 3 Tie of torpedo-armed aircraft by about 0800. But in no case would Nagumo have been able to send up his entire reserve force of Type 97s before Tomonaga had to land. The THTI on each carrier that had already been rearmed with Type 80 bombs simply couldn't be switched back in time. In terms of force, then, the difference between spotting now or waiting for the Kank squadrons to be completely rearmed essentially boiled down to about 15 aircraft. If Nagumo waited, his available forces would be as follows: Akagi, 18 Kank, 3 6-plane Chtai; Kaga, 26 or 27 Kank, 3 9-plane Chtai; Hairi, 18 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane Chtai; SRI, 16 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane Chtai. Total, 78 or 79 attack aircraft. Conversely, if Nagumo decided to spot immediately, the strike assets we can be reasonably sure were available were Akagi, 12 Kank, 2 of her total of 3 6-plane Chtai; Kaga, 18 Kank, 2 of her total of 3 9-plane Chtai; Hairi, 18 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane Chtai; SRI, 16 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane Chtai. Total, 64 attack aircraft. Clearly, even without the full torpedo plane complements from Akagi and Kaga, Nagumo had the potential to launch a powerful, well-balanced strike package. The 64 attack aircraft he had available immediately were easily capable of sinking 2 American carriers outright if properly employed. In fact, this group of aircraft represented more than twice the aggregate firepower that the Japanese would actually manage to throw at the American carriers during the day's later actions. However, such a strike would have broken the organizational symmetry of Cardiff 1's Kank groups by leaving a Chtai apiece of semi-armed planes sitting in both Akagi and Kaga's hangars, a move that no doctrinaire Japanese commander would have viewed with a favorable eye. A second alternative, and one which better preserved the fleet's organizational integrity, was to go with a more limited immediate strike and just send out Cardiff 2's 34 Kanbaku. This would have left Nagumo with another strike force in the process of arming, Cardiff 1's Kank, that could be launched shortly thereafter, and with Tomonaga's group to follow up later in the morning after they were recovered. The downside of this approach, though, was twofold. First, it reduced the power of the initial strike by reducing the sheer number of aircraft attacking. Second, it lowered the theoretical effectiveness of the strike by presenting the enemy with a one-dimensional threat, that is, no torpedo aircraft coming in at low altitude to stretch the enemy cap while the dive bombers attacked. Doctrine frowned on both of these sacrifices. Most likely, these were the only 2 options Nagumo and his staff considered in terms of launching an immediate attack. From the standpoint of post-war carrier operations, though, there were probably several more possibilities available to Kid Butai. If the enemy's southeast course heading was indicative of their conducting flight operations, then Kid Butai needed to consider its defensive needs as well. In light of this requirement and the technical and doctrinal imperatives at work, an approach that suggests itself is one wherein Cardivs 1 and 2 operated independently. Fuchida suggested something similar in the post-mortem analysis of his account, where he advocated attacking with only a single carrier division at a time while holding the other in reserve. However, it is clear that in making this suggestion, Fuchida, like Nagumo and his staff, was strictly thinking in terms of how best to deliver attacks against the enemy. The fleet's defense didn't figure into Fuchida's calculus, nor, apparently, that of any Japanese officer this day. Admiral Yamaguchi, too, was opposed to operating independently for the moment, although, as we shall see as the day wore on, his Cardiff 2 operated in an increasingly detached manner from Cardiff 1. A slightly different approach might have been to effect an actual split along functional lines, with one carrier division attending to the fleet's offensive chores, the other to the defensive. This is precisely what modern carrier divisions often do. This same concept, in fact, had already been cooked up by the Yokosuka Squadron, but had yet to be formally implemented in the Navy's doctrine. If such were attempted, The logical division of labour would have had Cardiff II launching an immediate attack against the Americans, while Cardiff I was tasked with air defence. This would have conferred a number of advantages on the Japanese. From an offensive standpoint, using only Cardiff II's dive bombers for an initial attack obviously meant that the force would not benefit from combined arms. Nevertheless, it placed the attack force in very capable hands. It was commonly acknowledged that Cardiff II's strike units were the best of the best. With the famed Commander Egusa leading the counter-strike, the Japanese could be confident of scoring against the enemy. This approach also obviated the need to shut down all of Kid Butai's flight decks simultaneously upon Tomonaga's arrival. Akagi and Kaga's strike planes could have been recovered almost immediately, thereby keeping only Hyries and S-Rai's morning strike planes circling, while Egusa's force was spotted and launched. An even more esoteric approach might have attempted roughly the same functionalized arrangement of offensive-defensive duties, but with S-Rai and Akagi designated as the cap carriers, and Hyrie and Kaga the attack carriers. In this way, a total of 36 strike aircraft, 18 Kanbaku and 18 Kank, could be spotted immediately. In other words, this arrangement would not only split Kid Butai into two roles, but also would split the divisional structure in allocating those roles. The benefit of such an approach would be in allowing Kid Butai to launch an immediate strike package that also benefited from combined arms. However, it is clear that Nagumo and his staff were hamstrung by Japanese naval doctrine in terms of considering such options. In fact, it is unlikely that either of the functionalized approaches outlined above would have even occurred to them, particularly since the fruits of Yokosuka's research had yet to be harvested. In 1942, Japanese doctrine was strictly offensive, and its prescription for practically any tactical situation was to attack the enemy with a full-strength combined arms strike period. Nagumo's needs for a more flexible approach were therefore negated by the Imperial Navy's doctrinal emphasis on mass. In the end, as he saw it, he had only one option to attack with everything he had, regardless of how long it took to make the necessary arrangements. Regardless of the composition of the strike force, another question that needed solving was the matter of providing a fighter escort for the attack. Fuchida later asserted that providing Zeros in the 0800 timeframe would have proven impossible, as the second-wave fighters had already been sent aloft to reinforce the cap. This meant that Cardiff II's Kanbaku would have to go in unescorted, a prospect that no one relished. This factor has been cited by many post-war scholars as being a determining factor in Nagumo's decision. A detailed examination of Kid Butai's flight records, though, reveals an entirely different situation. As mentioned, the four-carrier Hick-Keich had anticipated Tomonaga's return, and apparently tried to proactively manage the impending shutdown of the flight decks by ratcheting down the cap from about 0730. As a result, by about 0800, Kid Butai had the following fighters available in the hangars: Akagi, 12, Kaga, 18, Hyrie, 8, S-Ri, 9, for a total of 47. 35 of these Zeros had been on board their respective ships for at least half an hour, and could thus be reasonably assured of being fueled and munitioned. This was a powerful escort force, especially given the demonstrable superiority of Japanese fighter aircraft and pilots over their American counterparts. However, committing this body of fighters en masse to a strike against the Americans meant that Kid Butai would have almost no fighter reserve to reinforce the cap, which by now was down to just 9 fighters. If Nagumo chose to launch with both Cardiff I and II, this rather pitiful Capi would have to stay aloft for the duration of the spotting and launch process. Thereafter, they would need to be replenished and reinforced. Clearly, the number of fighters that would escort this second strike of the morning would have to be fewer than the 36 sent out with Tomonaga. However, it is equally clear that Nagumo could have provided his force with at least some escort. Indeed, an escort of a dozen Zeros could have easily been sent, and twice that many would probably not have been out of reach. The final factor Nagumo had to consider was how to maneuver his force. Kid Butai currently found itself between two enemies. Worse, Nagumo only really knew the location of one of these foes, Midway itself. Until Tone No. 4's position report was independently confirmed, he was dealing in vagaries as far as the American fleet was concerned. Knowing that he wanted to attack the American carrier, it made good sense to move away from Midway for the time being. Indeed, it may have even made sense to temporarily move away from the American naval force as well. In retrospect, Nagumo's subsequent decision to change course to the northeast and close the American force without first having sound knowledge of its composition and exact whereabouts was ill-conceived. It not only increased his danger from the American carriers, but it also had the effect of leaving Midway near to hand upon his southern flank. Nagumo was certainly well within his rights to maneuver freely. Frankly, by 0800 it should have been clear to everyone on Akagi's bridge that Yamamoto's battle plan needed to be summarily consigned to the ash can. Absolutely nothing was going according to plan this morning. Yet Nagumo still possessed some important advantages. For one thing, Japanese attack aircraft were somewhat longer ranged than their American counterparts. Taking a northwest course would have fulfilled his need to strike while employing his longer reach. He knew that the weather to his north wasn't good. If he could get back underneath the cold front he had come through on the previous day, he could use it to shield his movements. From there, it might have been possible to work around the Americans' northern flank. Nagumo might have suspected that the Americans were covering this quadrant with their own search aircraft, as indeed they were, but at least from that direction he could deliver attacks against them without fear of direct interference from Midway, which would be far to the south of where Nagumo would have hoped to develop the follow-on battle. Furthermore, he also could have used the time he spent manoeuvring northward to call for reinforcements in the form of Kakuta's second mobile force, and start bringing them down from the Aleutians. Students of the battle will note that withdrawing to the north or northwest in the 0800-0900 timeframe most likely would not have resulted in Kid Butai being missed altogether by the incoming American strike aircraft. Enterprise's dive bomber group eventually overhauled Kid Butai from the southwest and might also have detected a force lying directly to their north. Likewise, Kid Butai might have encountered Hornet's strike force as well. Thus, any maneuver Nagumo attempted in that direction would probably have exposed the fleet to a strike of some sort. However, this would potentially have had its benefits. Instead of facing attack groups from both Yorktown and Enterprise coming in simultaneously from several points on the compass, Kid Butai might have encountered these strikes sequentially and from a single direction, thereby making detection and interception much easier. The Japanese cap had already demonstrated that it could deal with a single vector threat if it was given sufficient warning. However, maneuvering in this fashion would cause problems, in that it necessarily meant throwing the entire operations timetable completely off kilter. This would undoubtedly have drawn fire from Yamamoto. Even if he were inclined to do so, Nagumo would have needed to begin coordinating not only the activities of his own vessels, but also helping reorient the various invasion and support forces as well. There was, in other words, a formidable level of plan inertia that would need to be overcome at an operational level. It wouldn't have been enough for Nagumo to simply radio Admiral Tanaka and say, "Stay where you are, and I'll let you know when it's safe to invade." Any hint of discarding the Commander-in-Chief's precious timetable would need to be backed up by mental toughness, sound logic, and the ability to supply combined fleet staff with reasonable estimates of when the job would be completed. Taking all together, and admittedly operating with the benefit of hindsight, the right answer to Nagumo's conundrum probably should have emphasized maneuver, offensive speed in preference to mass, and passive damage control. With 15 minutes in which to act, he didn't really have time to implement anything terribly fancy. But he could have helped himself immensely by immediately spotting every strike airplane in his hangars, whether they were armed or not, and launching them at the Americans. The 64 armed aircraft he had in hand were perfectly capable of doing enormous damage to his enemy, and by emptying his hangars, he removed the single greatest danger to his carriers, the presence of fueled and armed aircraft within them. However, even as Nagumo was considering these options, a new hurdle emerged. At 0753, Kirishima was seen to lay down smoke. Another American air raid was coming in. As we shall see, within a matter of just a few minutes, Nagumo would be under assault yet again. Launching an attack before Tomonaga returned was now going to be doubly difficult, in that he would need to spot aircraft in the face of an ongoing American attack. No right-minded HEK was going to be happy spotting aircraft while the force was being bombed. With the ships engaged in high-speed manoeuvring, pushing aircraft across an exposed flight deck and into their spots would have been hideously dangerous. Plane handlers could be maimed or crushed by an aircraft that got out of control, a very real possibility if the flight deck suddenly canted to one side. In fact, one of Zuikaku's plane handlers had been killed under similar circumstances at Coral Sea, and a plane lost overboard as a result. Furthermore, having the armed and fueled aircraft on deck directly exposed them to strafing attacks. Pressing home a spot and then launching under such circumstances would require both steady nerves and a steely resolve. Yet a truly insightful commander would have pointed out to his balking captains and HEK that keeping armed and fueled aircraft inside the ship during an American attack was, if anything, more dangerous than getting them airborne as quickly as possible, even in the face of enemy fire. The bottom line is that Nagumo chose not to attempt an attack at this time, most likely for a host of reasons. In the first place, he probably judged that trying to shoehorn an immediate strike in before Tomonaga landed was probably going to be too difficult to deal with, particularly with a new American attack rolling in. He might also have been concerned, too, that Tone No. 4's position report appeared to be bogus, meaning that further scouting work would be necessary to locate the enemy. Furthermore, while we know in hindsight that the fighter situation was not as dire as Fuchida later made it out to be, both Genda and Kusaka were apparently worried about finding enough escorts for the attack force at this time. They may not have known how far along the rearming activities had progressed within Akagi's hangars, nor what the status was of the fighters aboard the other ships in Kid-Butai. And while it is not documented in the available sources, it is likely that both Genda and Kusaka disliked the idea of distorting the symmetry of Kid-Butai's air groups by sending out a partial strike unit. Breaking the attack squadrons apart at this time meant trying to figure out where to integrate the remainder into strikes later in the day, if indeed the physical constraints of the force's flight decks would allow the leftovers to be spotted with Tomonaga's force later on. A partial strike now portended more mess and less efficiency later. It must be emphasized, too, that Nagumo's course of action was doctrinally correct. It favored mass and held out the promise of a fully integrated strike. Right now, the choices available to Nagumo were all tough calls between various half-measures, but by waiting a bit, he might not have to make the tough choices and would be able to strike with his full force. Many critics of his performance, Japanese and American alike, have neglected to acknowledge that he at least acted in a fashion that was doctrinally coherent. Indeed, if Nagumo had actually been fortunate enough to attack with Kid-Butai's complete reserve strike force, it would have unquestionably been the most powerful, best coordinated strike launched by either side during the day. Unlike their American counterparts, Japanese torpedo aircraft were fully capable of delivering telling attacks. Furthermore, the Japanese were well versed in coordinating simultaneous dive bomber and torpedo strikes against moving targets. Any American flat top on the receiving end of such an assault would have found itself in the most dreadful peril. Indeed, a full strike by all four of Nagumo's flight decks had the firepower to sink every American carrier in the battle, had they been caught operating in proximity.